So next is Dalia Mogahed, who you will recognize instantly as one of the faces from the film. Dalia is, of course, Senior Analyst and Executive Director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, which is a nonpartisan research center that provides data-driven analysis on the views of Muslim populations around the world, and we've just seen a wonderful example of that. She is the leading analyst for the survey featured in the film that we just saw. Dalia is a member of President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and that's something that I would like to ask you about later if we get the chance. So, Dalia.
Thank you very much. I wanted to, first of all, thank you all for spending Friday night here with us watching a documentary about data. So, congratulations.
You've been dreaming about this your whole life, right?
Exactly, I've been dreaming about it. I wanted to pick up a little bit on the issue of women, because we're here being hosted by a wonderful organization that focuses on women's rights and is made up of Muslim women attorneys. I recently did an analysis that appeared in foreignpolicy.com about women's rights in the Middle East and views of populations in the Middle East about women's rights. And I compared views of public views of women's rights to how women were actually doing on the ground in terms of having rights. Because I wanted to test this idea that a deficit in women's rights is because of a cultural, it's a cultural problem. So this idea that it's the culture stupid. Why don't Muslims have democracy? Because they don't understand it, they don't value it. Why don't Muslim women have rights? Because their cultures are, don't support or don't like women's rights or don't believe in women's rights. There's a good way to test that theory, which is to look at relationships between how people believe, what people think about women's rights and their actual rights on the ground. Is there a correlation? So asking the question, if you believe in women's rights more, are you actually seeing more women's rights in that country? So it's a very simple kind of analysis. So what I did is I used the Freedom House report that had just come out on assessment of women's rights in the Middle East, and then compared that to our research on sentiment, public sentiment. And what we found in our analysis, I had no idea what I'd find, but what we found is no relationship, no correlation, no inverse correlation, no direct correlation. There just simply was no statistical relationship between views of women's rights and their actual rights on the ground. In some cases, women's rights, people's views of women's rights surpass their actual rights. And so a good example is Saudi Arabia. They score very low. They're actually dead last in the Middle East in the Freedom House report. But in our research, they were in the middle in terms of actually support for women's rights when compared to other Middle Eastern countries. So public sentiment is ahead of actual reality. And then in some cases, public sentiment actually lags the rights women actually have. In Egypt, for example, that's one example, where what we need to do in that country is not more political reform necessarily, but education. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's a very different reality. So what we find when we look at empirical data is that it's case-by-case basis, and it's something we need to disaggregate. We cannot simply do these broad brush cultural explanations for realities on the ground. They're just not, these cultural explanations for deficit in democracy, deficits in gender justice are not supported by the empirical evidence. Each society is different, and these issues are societal problems. And I'm actually borrowing that from my friend Robin, who talked about the idea, it's not cultural, it's societal, and I completely agree with that. It's in some cases it's socioeconomic, in some cases it's just issues of security. Iraq and the Palestinian territories are good examples, where security security deficit leads or is very closely linked to a deficit in women's security specifically. So I'd like to discuss as questions come up more about our findings on women, because I do believe that all of this data is very fascinating, but when it comes to our research on women and the views of women and then the views of men on women and so forth, it's probably the area where there is the greatest misunderstanding. So when you look at the American public and you look at their perceptions of Muslims and Islam, we find that about half of Americans believe Muslims want peace. So the idea that Muslims are inherently violent is actually not shared by the vast majority of America, or not the vast majority, it's about half and half, so that's kind of up in the air. But the majority, slight majority, do believe Muslims do want peace. A similar majority think that Muslims, tolerate other faiths. But where there is almost consensus among Americans is the belief that most Muslims do not believe that men and women should have equal rights. 80% of Americans believe that most Muslims oppose gender equality. And that is actually just directly contradicted by the data, where we find most Muslims do believe men and women should have equal rights. When you look at where is the greatest gap in our understanding or in our perceptions, it really is around gender and women. So I think it's an important topic, and I'm really glad that Karamah has taken that up.